Christiana, it is so good to meet you today. Thank you ever so much for giving me your time. So you've been involved in climate negotiations for many years. As you've seen them develop and as you've seen the impact of climate change continue, are there things that have shocked you or surprised you? Particularly with what you see with climate change already happening?
Well, I'm surprised, actually stupidly surprised, because if we take science seriously, we should be forewarned that the negative impacts of climate change are already and will continue to accelerate. But every time I am more surprised by the speed and scale that we are facing. That is the piece that concerns me, and it concerns me in particular because the gap between what climate change is already doing and what we humans are not doing is only widening. And so I am hugely concerned about that gap.
Yeah, and as we think about that gap, one of the things that I write about in the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book, in the chapter that this interview is particularly relating to, is the need and the importance to keep within 1.5 degrees of warming. Can you explain why that's so important that we do that?
Thousands of climate scientists around the world from 40 different countries did their research and came up in October of 2018 with the groundbreaking report on climate. And that groundbreaking report, I won't recite 180 pages, I will summarize it in 3 sentences. What that report basically says is, if we go to a world that is 2 degrees warmer versus 1.5, we will have killed and exterminated 2 times as many biodiversity species. If we go to a world of 2 degrees versus 1.5, we will destroy 2 times as much infrastructure and economic value around the world. But most importantly, the report says if we go to 2 degrees versus 1.5, we will have 3 times as many people exposed to water scarcity, food insecurity, and temperatures at home that make home uninhabitable. That means forced migration. That means conflict. That means political chaos. And so because of that, because we cannot afford, from a moral perspective, to impose that kind of a pressure on future generations, that is why we, the adults who are at the table today, have the moral responsibility to do everything to put us on track to a maximum temperature of 1.5 and not open the door to 2 degrees.
Thank you. Thank you for stating so clearly the implications of the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and particularly thank you for stating so clearly the impact that our climate breakdown is having on people. There's been research out recently showing that people, especially in the UK, or people at least in the UK, see the link between climate change and the environment, the natural world, other species, but still need help making that link between climate change and poverty.
To me, that's the most important thing about addressing climate change in a timely fashion, because it's not just addressing climate change, it's when we do it that is going to impact the most vulnerable. So let's be very clear. The Industrial Revolution, which is coming to an end now, brought many creature comforts to a sizable part of the population. It also imposed unimaginable levels of poverty on other sizable parts of the population, in particular concentrated in developing countries. That is immoral, it is unjust, and it cannot be repeated. We cannot put the economic development of our society on track to wield even more pressure on those that are already most vulnerable because of their poverty, because of where they live, and because of the lack of resources to mitigate the impacts of climate change. That is the huge moral responsibility that we have. It's not about, for me, it's not about how many gigawatts do we change from coal to renewable energy. For me, addressing climate change is how are we going to protect the most vulnerable? It is not possible that because of the physical impacts of climate change, let's talk about hurricanes, let's talk about flooding, let's talk about drought, let's talk about all of those physical impacts that will obviously impact most the people who live in extreme poverty, whose homes are less secure against all of these impacts, who live in, anyway, the most brittle areas of the world, and who will be left, as I said before, without food, water, and home. And so that, to me, is truly the heart of climate change. That is why I work on climate change, because we have to protect the most vulnerable, and we cannot allow for a second historical injustice to fall upon them.
Thank you. So we know we need to keep our emissions, or we know we need to keep warming below 1.5. What do you think are the key areas that we need to focus on to do that? What as a world, as a global community, what do we need to do?
Well, the first piece to understand is that we have been increasing our greenhouse gas emissions consistently over the past 50 to 100 years. And we're still continuing, despite the Paris Agreement, despite everyone, on the streets, despite everything that we have done, we're still continuing the increase. So the first thing that we have to do is reverse that trend. The trend currently is toward the increase. This year, 2020, is the critical year for climate change. Not only because we will have the Conference of the Parties at the end of this year in the UK, but because from a global perspective, 2020 is the last year that we can afford to be on the increase of the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions. We have to reverse that trend, and instead of increasing our emissions, we have to start the descent of emissions unequivocally. And we have to be at half the emissions that we have today by the year 2030. So over this decade that starts in the year 2020 and finishes in 2030, we have to, over that decade, put ourselves in the position of halving our emissions. We are currently emitting as a planet 40 gigatons per year, all of us together. And by 2030, we have to be down at 20 gigatons. If we are not able to halve our emissions over this decade, everything else that is put out there by science and in the Paris Agreement of being at net zero by 2050 is out the door. And 1.5 degrees as a temperature limit is completely out the door. So there is no doubt that we all have to do this. Now, the question is that going to be done top down or bottom up? And my answer to that is both. It has to be done systemically, so we have to be able to decoal our grids, and the UK has done a brilliant job on that. But we also have to continue to take coal out of the grids, and in particular in Asia, where coal is continuing to increase. And those are systemic changes that have to be done for electricity, for transportation, for finance. All of that has to be done at a big level. But each individual has to also contribute. And so my invitation is actually quite simple. Every single one of us can, with many different carbon calculators that are out there on the web, we can very quickly quantify what our personal carbon footprint is, what our family's carbon footprint is. And as a determination that we take on a personal level in the year 2020, we should decide that by the year 2030, no matter where we are today, we have to be at 1/2 of that. In fact, let me go further than that. If you live in an industrialized country, you should actually aim for a cut of 60%, because we have to make space for people in the developing world that will have to increase. So to those who live in developed countries, my invitation is figure out what your carbon footprint is. And over 10 years, I'm not saying overnight. It's not from where you are to zero, and it's not from Sunday to Monday. It is 10 years. And if you cannot accomplish that in 10 years, then honestly, you should not be a proud human being. We can all do that. We can all do that. We can all figure out where can we cut, and how can I as an individual person, and certainly my family, and hopefully all my friends that I will also influence, be at half our current emissions over 10 years. That is completely doable.
And do you think there's a role particularly for people of faith in what you've said?
Obviously, people of faith and spiritual communities are much more sensitive to the connection that we have to this planet. Sadly, there are many people who walk on this planet without realizing what the connection is. And I was very grateful for the support of so many spiritual communities who came directly to support the process of the Paris Agreement because of their concern for the care of creation, if you believe in creation, or the care of the planet, if you have a different belief. But in any event, the spiritual nature of our understanding and our relationship with the planet, with every single tree, with every sentient being that is on this earth, is something that should not just fill us with awe and wonder and gratitude, but fill us with commitment as well, and understand that we have a responsibility that has been given to us because we happen to be the most powerful of all of the species here. That means that we carry a bigger responsibility than the other species. And that is a responsibility that we have to wield very carefully.
One question I'm often asked, and I never know how to reply, so I'd love to know how you reply, and I imagine you're asked it often as well. Do you have any hope? Can we avoid, we know we're seeing catastrophe already, can we avoid further catastrophe? Do you have hope as you look to the future?
I have more than hope, because I know that we as humanity have not dug into the fullness of our resources inside of us. We have, we've just been walking around as though we were robots, but how many of us have actually looked inside to face the question, what kind of a world are we building for our children, and what more can we do? And so I have more than hope. I know that we have a huge potential that has not been unleashed yet. I also know, as I said before, that we are facing a world that is forever changed, but that we have the capacity to build much better living conditions for our children, and their children, if we only set our mind to it.
Christiana, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for all that you've done globally as well. We are forever in your debt.
So. No. We all have to do it. We all have to do it.
Thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you.